A banker in distress. It was a bitterly cold March morning when a sharp, urgent knock rattled the door of 221 B. Baker Street. I was halfway through my tea when Holmes stood and opened the door to admit a man who looked as though he hadn't slept in days. He was tall, well-built, yet gaunt. His face was pale and drawn, and his eyes carried the haunted weight of shame and panic. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he gasped, "I am in the gravest trouble. My name is Alexander Holder. I am a senior partner in the banking firm of Holder Stevenson." Holmes nodded calmly. "Please, sit by the fire, and start from the beginning." Holder dropped heavily into the chair, removing his gloves with trembling fingers. "Yesterday afternoon I was visited by a nobleman, one whose name I cannot disclose. He came seeking a loan of £50,000. I hesitated, of course, for such a sum demands high collateral." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what was the security?" Holder's voice dropped to a whisper. "A barrel coronet, a priceless piece of regalia, known to be one of the Crown's most ancient treasures." Watson and I leaned forward. Holder continued. "It was a sudden arrangement. He wished the matter to be kept secret, so I agreed to hold the coronet overnight in my home safe, not at the bank." "Unwise," Holmes murmured. "Perhaps, but I thought it safe. I live just outside London, with my son Arthur, my niece Mary, and 3 servants. Holder pressed a hand to his temple. "I placed the coronet in my private bureau. Before dawn, I awoke to strange noises, and found my son, standing beside the open cabinet, the coronet in his hands, bent and broken, with 3 barrels missing." Watson drew a sharp breath. "Did he speak?" "He refused to explain, not a word, and now he's been arrested." Holmes asked, "You believe he is guilty?" Holder's face contorted. I don't know. I cannot believe it, and yet, who else could it be?" Holmes's voice was calm. "And the coronet?" Holder withdrew a silk-wrapped object from his coat and unrolled it, revealing a magnificent golden circlet, twisted at one end, with 3 empty sockets where green stones had once sparkled. Holmes stared at it for a long moment. "This," he said softly, "is a matter of honor, power, and temptation. The royal treasure." Alexander Holder remained seated, his hands clenched tightly around his knees as if trying to hold himself together. The barrel coronet lay gleaming on Holmes's desk, its twisted band and empty sockets a symbol of scandal that could shake the foundations of England's highest circles. "Tell me," Holmes said gently, "what happened after you discovered your son with the coronet?" Holder swallowed hard. "I shouted, accused him on the spot. He dropped it, ran out into the night without a word. I summoned the police." Watson asked, "And your niece Mary?" "She was the one who woke me. She heard the noise before I did. We met at my door, then went down together. She looked shocked when she saw Arthur, but said nothing." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Describe your son." "Arthur is 22, headstrong, proud. He was once on good terms with Mary, but they've been distant of late. Still, I never doubted his honor until now." Holmes walked to the window. "And the household?" 3 servants. Lucy, the maid, who's been with us a year. A footman, James, and a cook, Martha. I trust them all, or thought I did." Holmes turned. "Did anyone else know the coronet was in your home?" Holder hesitated. "I didn't mention it to anyone, not even Arthur, but I suppose Mary might have seen me place it in the bureau." Holmes tapped the desk lightly. "You said the coronet was damaged, bent, yet only 3 barrels missing." "Yes." "Then it was partially destroyed, but not taken." "Correct. I recovered it in Arthur's hands, twisted, but the 3 stones, gone, We searched the house, grounds, drains. Nothing. Holmes narrowed his eyes. That is the detail which interests me most. A thief strong enough to bend royal gold, foolish enough to leave the bulk of it behind, yet careful enough to vanish 3 gems without a trace. Holder stood. Mr. Holmes, I beg you, if you can find those stones and clear my son's name, I shall owe you more than life itself. Holmes nodded once. You will have your answer, Mr. Holder. But first, I must visit the scene of the crime. There are shadows in your house, sir, ones you have not seen. A son accused. It was nearly noon when Holmes and I accompanied Mr. Holder to his residence in Streatham, a grand, ivy-covered home surrounded by a walled garden and trimmed hedges. The place spoke of wealth and order, yet its silence now felt heavy, as if shame lingered in the very walls. Holder led us into his study, a stately room with oak bookshelves, green velvet curtains, and a broad writing desk. In the corner stood the infamous bureau, its lower drawer broken open, the lock still damaged, and faint scratches on the wood. This is where I stored the coronet, he said quietly, wrapped in chamois beneath my private papers. I locked it myself. Holmes crouched beside the drawer, examining it closely. Prized open with a chisel, he murmured. A crude tool, but used efficiently. He then walked to the door and examined the carpet, the skirting board, even the hinges. His gaze was restless but calculating. Where was your son standing when you found him? Just there, Holder said, pointing near the fireplace. He had the coronet in his hands. It was bent, like now. Did you see anyone else? No. Arthur fled before I could question him. Holmes rose. And Miss Mary? She met me outside the study. She appeared shaken. I asked if she had seen anything. She only said no and retired to her room. We moved through the hall towards Arthur's bedroom. It was modest, neat, with little in the way of decoration. A writing crop lay on the dresser beside a half-burned candle and a book of poetry. Watson said softly, "This doesn't look like the room of a criminal." Holmes said nothing. He opened the wardrobe, examined the soles of the boots, then glanced out the window. A flat lawn below, easy enough to leave the house unseen. We returned to the study, where Holmes stood in silence, as though listening to echoes only he could hear. "I would like to speak with Miss Mary," he said at last. "Alone." Holder hesitated. "Of course, I shall fetch her." As he left, Holmes turned to me and whispered, "Arthur is not our man." I blinked. "You're sure?" Holmes nodded. "The damage to the bureau is real, but the intent was not to steal the coronet. It was to make it appear stolen. Someone wanted the boy blamed, someone within this house." Holmes listens. Miss Mary Holder entered the study with a hesitant step. She wore a pale blue dress and carried herself with a composure that barely concealed the turmoil behind her eyes. Holmes greeted her politely and gestured toward the armchair opposite his own. "Miss Holder," he said calmly, "I appreciate your time. I ask only for honesty. My aim is not to accuse, but to understand." She sat down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "I've already told the police everything I know." Holmes offered a gentle smile. "Sometimes, Miss Holder, the truth is not in what has been said, but in what has been omitted." Mary's face tightened. "You and your cousin Arthur were once close, were you not?" Holmes asked. "Yes," she replied softly. "We grew up together, but things have changed between us lately." "Changed? How?" She hesitated. He didn't approve of someone I was seeing. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Would that be Sir George Burnwell?" Her eyes widened. She said nothing, but the answer was clear. I'm well aware of Sir George's reputation, Holmes continued. His gambling debts, his friendships with women of fortune. He is not a man known for noble intentions. Mary's voice was barely above a whisper. Arthur warned me, but I didn't listen. Holmes leaned forward, lowering his voice. Did you tell Sir George about the coronet? A tear slipped down her cheek. I mentioned it. I didn't mean to do harm. He asked me questions. When would the house be empty? Where was the key kept? I didn't know he would. She broke off. Arthur must have seen something that night, she whispered. He tried to stop it. Holmes nodded. And instead of exposing you, he allowed himself to be accused. Mary buried her face in her hands. I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't think George would steal. He said he just needed collateral. He promised to return the stones. Holmes stood and spoke with quiet firmness. Miss Holder, your cousin is in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. Your silence protects a thief and punishes an innocent man. That is not love, it's cowardice. She looked up, eyes red. What should I do? Holmes's voice was calm. Let me handle Sir George, but when the time comes you must speak. The truth may cost you, but silence costs others far more. The scene of the crime. The next morning, Holmes and I returned to Streatham under cover of a clouded sky. Holmes carried nothing but his walking stick and a small notebook, but his mind, I could tell, was already spinning with a plan. This is not merely about stolen gems, Watson, he said as our cab jostled down the frozen road. It is about betrayal, twice committed, but only once intended. Back at the Holder residence, we were greeted by Alexander Holder, who looked even more worn than before. Holmes asked for permission to re-examine the study and surrounding areas in full daylight and without interruption. He began with the bureau once more, this time focusing not only on the drawer but on the floor beneath it. After a few moments of silent study, Holmes crouched and retrieved a small, triangular chip of green stone from between the floorboards. A shard, he muttered, broken from one of the missing barrels. Watson leaned in. Could it have been dropped during the struggle? Unlikely, Holmes replied. More likely it cracked during hurried removal. A careless thief, but not unskilled. Holmes then moved to the windows, checking the locks. One was slightly ajar, almost imperceptibly. Someone knew this house. They didn't break in, they were let in, or expected. He paced the room twice, then stopped. Watson, observe this. The coronet was taken, bent, 3 stones removed, then returned, all within minutes and without waking the household. Why? To frame Arthur, I guessed. Holmes nodded. Yes and no, the thief never intended to return it. But someone interrupted them, forced the job to be rushed, Arthur, I believe. He turned to Mr. Holder. Did you ever notice if Sir George Burnwell visited the house in the evenings? Holder blinked. Once or twice, yes. I assumed he came to call on Mary. Why? Because he knew the layout, the locks, the location of the coronet, and because Mary trusted him. At that moment, a knock came. A uniformed messenger handed Holmes a sealed envelope. He opened it, read quickly, then smiled. Sir George is in London. He's to dine at the Turf Club tonight. He looked to me. Watson, bring your revolver. We pay Sir George a visit after supper. A trail of lies. That evening, Holmes and I waited across the street from the Turf Club, a gentleman's establishment frequented by men of title, wealth, and, on occasion, scandal. The gas lamps flickered in the fog, casting long shadows across the stone pavement. At precisely 8:30, Sir George Burnwell emerged. He was tall, handsomely dressed, and moved with the confidence of a man too arrogant to imagine the law could touch him. Holmes nudged me. "That's our man." We followed at a distance as Burnwell strolled casually down the street, unaware of the net closing around him. A few blocks later, Holmes quickened his pace. "Sir George," he called. Burnwell turned, startled, then forced a smile. "Mr. Holmes, is it? I've heard your name. What can I do for London's famous detective?" Holmes's voice was friendly, too friendly. "A matter of jewels, actually. 3 green barrels, very old, very valuable. I believe you've had dealings with them recently." Burnwell's smile faded. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." Holmes stepped closer. "Then you won't mind if we speak privately." Burnwell glanced nervously at me, then at the street. "I've no time." Holmes's voice hardened. "Then you'll speak to the police instead." Burnwell's expression twisted. "You have no proof." Holmes smiled coldly. "We have a chip of barrel found at the crime scene. We have testimony linking you to the household, and we have Miss Mary Holder, ready to testify." Burnwell's bravado cracked. "You wouldn't dare involve her." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You involved her the moment you used her affection to rob her family." There was a tense silence. Finally, Burnwell spoke, low and bitter. "Very well. The stones are in my rooms in Jermyn Street. Take them and forget the rest." Holmes's voice was like steel. "No, Sir George. You'll deliver them yourself, to Mr. Holder, tonight, with an apology, or the next hand you shake will be that of a constable." Burnwell hesitated, then nodded with a sneer. "You've made your point, Mr. Holmes." He walked away stiffly. I turned to Holmes. "You're letting him go?" "For now," Holmes replied. "But tonight he walks into Mr. Holder's house not as a guest, but as a man exposed." The housemaid's secret. We returned to Streatham later that night, accompanied by Sir George Burnwell, who followed Holmes like a shadow with clipped dignity and clenched jaw. When we arrived at the Holder residence, the air was thick with tension. Alexander Holder was waiting in the study. His expression soured the moment he saw Burnwell enter. "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes raised a hand calmly. "Mr. Holder, I present to you the man who stole the 3 barrels from the coronet in your keeping, Sir George Burnwell." Burnwell scoffed, but Holmes's eyes were unblinking. "Return them." With visible reluctance, Burnwell reached into his coat and removed a small velvet pouch. Inside lay 3 glittering green stones, unmistakable in size, shape, and brilliance. Holder gasped. "My God, you really did it!" Holmes gestured for him to examine them. "Have them set back into the coronet. I assure you they are genuine." Holder turned towards Burnwell, rage and disbelief in his voice. You who I welcomed into my home, who courted my niece," Holmes cut in. "Sir George used Miss Holder's affection to gain knowledge of the coronet's location. He entered the study under cover of night, forced the drawer, removed the gems, and left. But he did not expect young Arthur to intervene." At that moment, Mary Holder appeared in the doorway, pale and stricken. "Uncle," she whispered. He turned to her, eyes wide. "You knew?" She nodded slowly, tears brimming. "He said he'd pay me back. I believed him." Burnwell scoffed. "She told me where it was. She knew what she was doing." Holmes's voice cut through. "Enough. Mary has admitted her mistake, but she did not steal the gems. You did, and Arthur, rather than expose his cousin, chose silence." Alexander Holder looked at Mary, heartbreak etched in his features. "You've brought shame to our name." Mary trembled. I'm sorry. I thought I was helping someone I loved. Holder turned away. And what of Arthur? Holmes placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. He can be freed, but he deserves an apology from all of you. Sir George muttered, "This is absurd. You've no intention to charge me." Holmes smiled coldly. "I don't need to. You've been judged already." Burnwell left in silence, the door closing behind him like a verdict. Holmes's trap. The next morning, under a pale spring sky, Holmes and I visited the local constabulary where Arthur Holder had been held. His release was swift and met with astonishment by the police, who had believed the case to be straightforward. When Arthur saw Holmes, his first words were not of gratitude, but of disbelief. "How did you know?" he asked. "Even I couldn't prove my innocence." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Because you refused to speak. Only the innocent suffer in silence to protect the guilty. I've seen it before." Arthur shook his head slowly. "I couldn't expose Mary, not after everything she's been through." As we rode back to Streatham, Holmes explained his deductions. The coronet was bent, but only 3 stones missing. That tells us the thief wasn't trying to take the whole object, only a part. It was a crime of precision, not destruction. Watson leaned forward. "And the chipped gem?" "Exactly," said Holmes. "A thief planning a clean escape wouldn't drop evidence. Burnwell had to work quickly. Arthur likely interrupted him mid-theft, and when the coronet was returned to the bureau, it was clumsily replaced. A guilty person would not risk keeping the frame unless they had to leave it behind." Arthur frowned. "But how did you know it was Burnwell?" Holmes answered, "Because your father said you and Mary had grown distant. I inquired and learned that Sir George was courting her, despite his reputation, and Mary, foolish but loyal, betrayed her household for him." Arthur's voice was heavy. "I should have said something, but I thought, if the stones were returned, the matter could end quietly." Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were noble, but silence is not always mercy." Back at the house, Alexander Holder met his son with open arms. For a long time neither spoke. There were no words needed between a father who had doubted and a son who had sacrificed. In the corner, Mary stood quietly, watching with red-rimmed eyes. Holmes turned to me and whispered, "There is justice in truth, Watson, even when it comes late." The real thief. That evening, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, where he, with pipe in hand and firelight dancing across his face, outlined the final shape of the case, each piece of evidence clicking into place like a well-oiled lock. "You see, Watson," he began, "what made this case unique was not the theft, but the illusion of guilt. Everything was designed to make Arthur appear the culprit, but only someone within the household could create such a carefully timed deception." I nodded. Mary's silence gave it away. "Yes," Holmes agreed. "Her discomfort, her contradictions, and yet her guilt wasn't born of greed, but misplaced trust." He gestured to his notebook. "Let us walk through the logic. 1. The coronet was damaged, not taken. That implies someone was interrupted and fled before completing the theft. Arthur. 2. Arthur refuses to defend himself. A guilty man often protests too much. An innocent man, especially one trying to protect another, stays silent. 3. Mary reacts with visible anxiety. She knows more than she tells. Not fear of Arthur, but of exposure." I asked, "And the shard of beryl?" Holmes smiled. "The strongest physical clue, found beneath the bureau. It didn't fall by accident. It snapped during the removal. That's when Arthur must have intervened, causing Burnwell to flee with only the stones he had already loosened." I sat back, absorbing the chain of reasoning. But if Arthur hadn't walked in, Holmes nodded. The coronet would have vanished completely. Burnwell likely intended to sell the gems and disappear. Mary's love gave him access. Her silence gave him time. I asked, "And the housemaid, Lucy?" Holmes tapped his chin. She saw something, I suspect. But loyalty or fear silenced her. We didn't need her testimony. The facts, properly arranged, speak louder. He looked toward the fire. "What's remarkable," he said softly, "is not the theft, but the restraint. Arthur sacrificed his freedom to protect his cousin's name. Mary sacrificed her dignity to protect the man who betrayed her. And Burnwell, well, he sacrificed nothing. Until now." I nodded. "And the coronet?" Holmes leaned back. "Restored, but its gold is bent forever. Like trust, once distorted, it rarely returns to form." Confession in the dark. A few days later, under quieter skies and a more peaceful atmosphere, Holmes and I received a discreet note delivered by hand. It was from Mary Holder. "Mr. Holmes, I owe you the truth, though I fear I've already said too little, too late. May it comfort you to know the stones have been returned, and Sir George will never set foot near me again. I will leave England. My uncle has agreed to send me abroad. I do not expect forgiveness, but I will carry the weight of my betrayal for the rest of my life." Holmes folded the note and set it gently on the table beside the now polished and restored barrel coronet, which had been quietly returned to the authorities and placed back under Crown protection. "Poor girl," Watson murmured. Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then he turned his gaze toward the fire. "There are criminals who steal for gain, Watson, and there are those who steal by love, blindly, desperately. Mary never meant to cause ruin, but she forgot the most dangerous truth. Love given to the wrong person is a key in the wrong lock." Watson nodded slowly. "Arthur loved her still, even after everything." Holmes replied, "Yes, and that is why this case ended in silence rather than scandal, because true honor rarely speaks, it endures." Later that evening, Arthur Holder came by briefly to thank Holmes. The young man's expression was lighter, though there was still sadness behind his eyes. "I've declined to press charges," he said. "Let her leave with what dignity remains." Holmes nodded. "You are wiser than many who bear titles." Arthur smiled faintly. "And you, far more just than any courtroom." After he left, Holmes turned to me. "This case will not be remembered in the Times. No grand trial, no villain in shackles, just a house quietly healing." I took out my notebook. "And yet," I said, "it deserves to be remembered." Holmes looked at the coronet one last time. "Write it then, Watson. Write it, not as a tale of theft, but as one of loyalty, frailty, and the crooked line between love and dishonor." And so I did. The weight of reputation. The following morning, I found Holmes in a particularly reflective mood. He stood by the window, arms folded, gazing out onto Baker Street as carriages clattered by and the city stirred awake. The case of the barrel coronet was over, but something lingered in the air, like a question unanswered. Without turning, Holmes spoke. "Watson, do you know why this case affected me more than others?" I closed my notebook. "Because it touched the highest levels of society?" He shook his head. "Because it exposed a truth often hidden beneath titles and trust. That character has little to do with wealth or lineage, that even in a house of respectability darkness finds a door." He walked back to the fireplace and stood before it, eyes distant. Holder was a man of reputation. He risked everything to protect a national treasure, and in doing so, nearly lost his family. Mary, blinded by charm, sacrificed honor for emotion, and Arthur, he bore false guilt for days because he valued the dignity of others more than the safety of his name. He looked at me now, with rare gravity in his voice. That is the kind of nobility no coronet bestows. I remained quiet, struck by the depth of his observation. Holmes reached for the morning paper. The incident had been reported only as a misunderstanding among relatives. No mention of Burnwell, no scandal, no disgrace. The world sees what it is allowed to see, he muttered, and so reputations remain intact, even when cracked beneath the surface. I asked, "Do you think Mary will ever return?" "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but she will never return unchanged." He sat in his chair and stared into the fire again. "There are cases where solution brings no satisfaction, only stillness." Then he glanced at me. "But that too has its place, does it not?" I nodded. "And the coronet?" I asked. "Repaired," he said, "but like trust, it will always bear a scar." Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "Sometimes, Watson, the heaviest things we carry are not stolen gems, but the things we could not say in time." The crown restored. Days passed, and with them, the echoes of the scandal faded into silence. The barrel coronet was returned discreetly to its place among the nation's crown jewels. The newspapers carried nothing more than a vague note, a minor incident, resolved in private. But in Baker Street the memory lingered. I sat by the hearth, finishing the final lines of my account. The coronet was bent, but not lost. The honor of a young man preserved. A love misplaced revealed. A household shattered and slowly rebuilt. Holmes, as ever, remained detached, or so it seemed. "That coronet," I said aloud, "is more than gold and gems. It carried with it duty, history, and temptation." Holmes nodded without looking up. "It also carried trust, and when that was broken, everything else nearly followed." He tapped the edge of his pipe thoughtfully. "Arthur could have shouted his innocence from the rooftops. Instead, he stayed silent, for the sake of someone who had betrayed him. That kind of restraint is rare and admirable." "And Mary?" I asked. Holmes's face grew still. "She acted in weakness, not wickedness. Her punishment will not come from the courts, but from the weight of memory." He stood and walked to the window, the morning light catching the edge of his silhouette. "Burnwell will go on, until he slips again. But that's the thing about men like him, Watson. They believe in luck. I believe in timing." I closed my notebook. "You think justice was done?" Holmes was silent for a moment. "Not in the way a judge would define it. But sometimes justice is quieter. It arrives not with a sentence, but with a reckoning." He turned to me, the firelight soft behind him. "And what of you, Watson? How will you write this tale?" I smiled. "I'll write it not as a story of theft, but of sacrifice." Holmes nodded once. "Then write it true." And so I did.